All right, so it's our final panel for today. And the title of this panel is Bridging the Talent Gap, right? Grooming Carbon Talent for Singapore and Southeast Asia. We are really privileged here to have a great lineup of speakers, Rueban, Tommy, and Ivan. I'll let them introduce themselves very shortly, but very briefly, I think we've heard already from the opening speech minister onwards in the previous panel about the growing interest for carbon markets in Asia and Southeast Asia as a rich environment for that growth, perhaps partly driven by greater clarity, for example, around Article 6 market rules, and also driven by some of the initiatives by governments in the region. We therefore today wanted to assemble a panel to get views from our panelists on this topic of carbon talent. Is there enough talent? What are the gaps, if any? And what can we do about it? Right? So before we dive into questions, we will hear from the panelists to introduce themselves. We'll get into questions, and then we'll open up for questions later. Perhaps you can start, Rueban. Could you share a little bit about yourselves, and then Tommy and then Ivan?
Thanks, Daniel. And before I start, a huge thank you to GenZero Enterprise SG as well as EDB for having me on this panel. So I'm Rueban. I'm glad to meet everyone with WWF International, and I lead what WWF calls the Carbon Finance and Markets Taskforce. So throughout the network of over 100 offices that WWF has, I coordinate the carbon finance and carbon markets related work within the organization.
Tommy.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Tommy Ricketts. I'm the CEO and co-founder of BeZero. We're a rating agency, a GenZero portfolio company, and a partner with Daniel on an upcoming carbon module. We work in a number of different countries, but have our principal regional headquarters in Singapore here.
I'm Ivan. I'm from the Trade Division at Enterprise Singapore. So I think probably Enterprise Singapore is not foreign to many of you, but I would just like to touch about one role that probably isn't that much covered about Enterprise Singapore, which is we are also the government agency in charge of building up Singapore as a global trading hub. And if you look at Singapore, one of the things that's remarkable is that although we don't have natural resources besides good people like you there, but we have managed to be a trading hub for a lot of products like energy products, agri-commodity products, and metal products. So what we believe is that Singapore, despite being a small country, we can also be a hub for carbon project, for carbon credit. And the way we look at it is that we don't just look at the demand from Singapore, we have to look at the demand from the region. So how do we make sure that Singapore is able to serve this market? So we look at it from a few layers. One will be working together with our sister agencies like EDB and MAS to build up a community of companies that can provide a solution, from traders to financiers, project developers, and so on. The other is to look at institution building. I think earlier on, our minister and Jermaine from EDB covered that. For example, we have the CAT Trust. We also have the Singapore Carbon Market Alliance. So this is about getting the institutions so that we can sort of view the so-called machinery for carbon credit development and trading. And the last is manpower, which I think we can share more about later.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Rueban, maybe we can start with yourself, right? So I guess the context is WWF has been involved in carbon markets for at least 2 decades now. You've obviously kind of seen it through its ups and its downs. Just right where we are now, and with the benefit of that experience, right? How would you describe the landscape for talent in carbon markets in Southeast Asia? And what skill sets are most important right now, and where are they most needed?
Thanks, Daniel. Before I go into your specific questions, I think it's important to understand the context which will guide my answer. But so the first is looking at the carbon market ecosystem as a whole. Right? Beyond the demand blip that we're seeing in the market that was spoken about earlier, the reality is that the carbon market is growing as an ecosystem. And it's growing not only in size, and so for example, in terms of compliance markets, we have more than 75 national or subnational compliance schemes that generate demand. Right? In the voluntary carbon market, the number of standards, for example, has grown exponentially. Right? It's to the extent that now we have calls for harmonization when talking about standards and bringing them together. For example, in CORSIA, we had 21 different standards applying to it. And that is a huge growth from the 3, 4, or at least from a WWF perspective, when WWF set up gold standard in 2003, that has really grown into the number of standards coming into this space. But it's also grown in terms of sophistication. So we see, for example, now the rating agencies being available and the value that they bring to the ecosystem. But also insurance mechanisms that allow financial institutions to then come in and finance projects. So the context in which we're operating is that the carbon market as an ecosystem has really grown, and the panel earlier spoke about the demand drivers that would likely continue to lead to the growth of the ecosystem as a whole. But then I want to double click in 3 aspects within this growth that we see more pressing needs for talent, and that's really driven by how the decarbonization as a whole is developing, right? So the first aspect is the development of voluntary decarbonization standards, right? So for example, we see the SBTi, for example, putting out a revised guidance, and the ISO is following suit. And what this means is that you have more and more companies adopting these standards and needing help and support in helping to implement those standards. Target setting is the first step of the journey, and then the corporates have to move towards decarbonizing them. And this is where you spoke about the regional focus, and I want to highlight this. So Asia has been a bright spot when it comes to corporate decarbonization. If you look at the SBTi, for example, Japanese companies lead as the top country that has the most companies that have science-based targets set under SBTi, followed by the UK and followed by the US. If you look at it in Asia as well, India saw a 5 times growth in number of companies setting science-based targets. So the growth that we're seeing in Asia, and there's going to be help and support and capacity needed for these companies to then, after they've set this target, to do portfolio management, to go about implementation activities so that they can embark on that journey. The second area that I would like to point out and highlight, which is activity types, right? And what we see in the market right now, and specifically the voluntary market as well, which is a growth for demand for removals, right? And that is partly for a few reasons, partly because the corporate standards have a certain bias towards residual emissions and carbon markets being a solution for that, and that has driven certain demand. Some of that has come from the companies themselves that have near-term removals targets. But what that means is that now you have a demand for removals for which traditionally there hasn't been a lot of knowledge and expertise into driving those solutions. And I say this with some context, right? So if we look at traditional carbon markets or the clean development mechanism, for example, that Alvin highlighted in the last panel, majority of projects in the clean development mechanism were renewable energy projects. And they were renewable energy projects and also some energy efficiency and some methane reduction projects. And these projects were largely housed in China, India, and to some extent Brazil as well, right? And this is, as a project type, it's vastly different from removal type projects that we have both nature-based and tech-based. And now if I can double click in that further, that in itself presents a unique challenge when it comes to financing these projects, right? Because unlike renewable energy that has an underlying asset and that has, in many cases, a clearer price and demand signal of where the energy offtakes will happen, so on and so forth, that does not quite translate when we're talking about removals projects, right? Especially nature-based removals projects, where there isn't an asset to be spoken of other than the land on which the reforestation is happening, for example. But also, it has much longer payout periods, right? You're talking when you plant a tree, it's going to be 5, 7 years before credits are being generated. So there is a gap in capacity when you're talking about how do we build that knowledge and understanding among our investors, financial institutions, of how we finance and channel finance to removals projects, and in particular nature-based removals projects, right? And the third area where we definitely are seeing a greater talent crunch is in response to the growth of compliance markets. And specifically, I'm talking about the re-emergence of the UN-backed carbon markets. And this is both for Articles 6.2 and 6.4. More than half of countries that have submitted NDCs have said that they will or are interested to participate in carbon markets. What does that mean? Is that those countries will now have to undertake policies that form the regulatory bedrock that will enable them to participate in markets. And capacity and talent needs to go into helping these countries adopt and implement these policy measures so that they can effectively participate in markets.
So thanks for that, Ruben. So basically, gaps due to the rise in need from Article 6 implementation in the region, and also the difference between renewable projects and removable projects. This give rise to some of the gaps. Thanks, excellent for that, Ruben. Sort of shifting gears to you, Tommy, you know, a little bit as to what Ruben alluded to. 10 years ago, you know, carbon credit rating agencies just, you know, didn't exist. And given the growth and the context which Ruben painted today in terms of where carbon markets are, the arrival of BeZero and some of your peers in this space have been quite essential, I think, to enhancing the transparency and trust in the VCM. You run an international team spanning more than 10 countries now, I think multiple locations. Would you be able to share, you know, what has it been like to try and hire talent in these different locations? Difficult, fairly easy, and what would you say is the most compelling reason for someone to join this sector, either as a young or mid-career hire?
Thanks, yeah. So right now we're about 180 people, of which about 100 or so are in the UK. Offices in New York, elsewhere in the States, and here. So maybe I'll take a step back. I was trying to find the number of environmental science graduates from Singaporean local universities, and the only number I could find was around 100. To put that into context, in the UK it's about 15,000, and in the US it's actually fewer, so it's more like 10,000. Probably no surprise that the number one type of degree in this country is around professional and financial services. So just from a starting position, like what is the carbon market? It's policy, it's finance, and it's environmental sciences. I started my career, I'm a historian really, but I did 5 years as a lobbyist, and then I spent 5 years writing briefs for someone in this room as a financial analyst, and now I do something in between. And I think when we're looking at this, and we're looking at bringing people in, I think there are two types of tests. And this is maybe a bit that would only add to what Fred was saying earlier. Can you get someone off the shelf? Right? Can you bring someone in either as a new recruit or as someone as an experienced hire that's off the shelf, that has, you know, requisite skills? Off the shelf as a new recruit, very hard. It doesn't really exist anywhere. It's not really a case of being specific to Singapore. Off-the-shelf experience, very expensive, and typically in this market, you know, quite overbid. The average employee at ours is actually similar to starting at a tech company and better paid than working at a bank, to give you a sense of like the price competition for staff. And so in that sense, you need to actually treat it like a talent creation problem. So we go into it going, how do I find adjacencies? How do I find someone that has an adjacent skill set in finance or in policy or in environmental science that I can translate to? I can teach finance to a scientist, I can teach science to a policy person, I can teach policy to one of the two of them. So that's the first thing I'd say. We always look for adjacencies. And the missing piece is mid-cycle. So mid-cycle careers, I left my career at 33 to do this business. That's a perfect time, right? Generationally, you said you've got a lot of people who are sitting around going, when I get asked when I'm 60, what did I do whilst the world was going from 2 to 3.5? You know, I clipped my coupon working at a bank. Well, that might not have been the best thing you could have done. I jumped headfirst into a new industry in any part of it, and I tried to join the decarbonisation space. So I think first of all, it's trying to bring that across, of which basically they also don't want to take a pay cut, so that's something worth noting. The other thing in terms of hiring is very large differences in pay. Give you a sense, in the US, we 2 times index that to London base. In Singapore, it's 1.5. So weirdly, London is one of the cheapest places to recruit people now. Just to give you a sense, Singapore's expensive. I have to give people pay rises to move here. So that's maybe just a nice color in terms of sort of the global competition. And then in terms of the region, I think you are seeing a very, well, first of all, Singapore needs to be celebrated as being probably the single most coherent strategy of any country in the world. It's just an amazing thing to hear the quality of the speakers, the quality of the personnel, etc. But it is talking about being a hub for the flow of activity. And it's generating a little bit of domestic demand through its policies, which is fantastic. But that hub and flow means it naturally lends itself to services. And so you're really kind of creating a services culture here. And so I think, yeah, that there is a lot. And so just on the last point, you've got local and international talent, you've got new and you've got existing workforce. And I think if you think about that as a grid, the local and new, that's an area you're focused on, right? Training, building that up, trying to create that next generation. But that's probably an area where there is definitely the lowest percentage here. We haven't been able to find a cost-effective scientist at the price we point, so we're going to bring someone here on secondment. Gives you an example. Very senior people, yes, but just not more junior ranks. But then actually you've got a wealth of experience, probably not working in jobs that start with an environmental, but in the existing and local. So that would be an area of how do you convert those to work into this sector. And then internationally, it is a generally pretty easy place to come. You have an amazing administration that will help you with the processes. It's not without burden, but it's much easier now than in the US, for example, to bring people here. And actually, I think that interface between bringing international skills and then linking that to training domestic is a great synergy that should be celebrated. It shouldn't be exploited. So that's kind of a bit of a picture, I'd say, of the ecosystem from my side.
And has it been easy to sort of convince people to switch careers, sort of like, for example, to focus on traditional banking, for example?
Yeah, so one of the, again, to that effect, in my bank business, we have software engineers, data engineers, scientists, policy people, ex-sales, finance sales. I think I have 13 different industries. They all have different price points. So that's probably one of the challenges. Now, the good thing for the scientists is they all get to pay an increase. They're working in academia, they're getting paid quite poorly. They come to the private sector, they get a big reversion. For other sectors, I can't really justify a sales salary from a bank to come into this sector. Well, if I can, that's why I have to keep raising money. But and then, sorry, I was Fred. But no. So I think that is possible. Now, the one thing you have is this sense of, it talks about altruism or the sense of like wanting to do the world to be hunky-dory. For me, it's limited. Actually, we were doing a recruitment process recently, and we asked, to what effect is hiring AI engineers? Is it a function of like working in the environmental sector? And interestingly, they said that was actually considered a disadvantage because we weren't serious enough about tech. So I think it depends on the sector you're looking at. But generally, a lot of people want to make peace with the fact that what they're doing is aligned, at least, to what they're trying to achieve. The only bit that you have to balance that with is if you can't create a compelling financial story for them to join this sector, then you get a lot less joining than you would if you can actually meet, salary peerages. That would be the area, yeah.
Oh, excellent. Thanks for that color, Tommy. I sort of move on to yourself, Ivan, now. So, Ivan, your day-to-day, you head up many different initiatives in Enterprise Singapore. And certainly, as you mentioned, right, one of them is trying to build up Singapore as a hub for carbon services and trading, and also plugging into the wider region. If you take a step back, or you sort of take the helicopter view, right, what is the Singapore government's sort of strategy towards developing carbon market talent for the sector here in Singapore and the region? Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think what Rueban and Tommy sort of provided the context for what I will share next. I think we do recognize that there's still a lot of work to be done, and our work with the various agencies began about a few years ago. So one of the things we've recognized is that the carbon services and trading sector is, I will put it as an old new sector. Now, back then in about 2009 or so, when we were looking at this, for those of you that were in the sector, you remember that there was a lot of optimism because back then there was the CDM projects. There was also a lot of talk about how other countries probably will, have their own carbon market. And then it kind of crashed in about, I think, after the GFC. So suddenly we realized that from then till now, we don't have a lot of the talent in Singapore. So when we started looking at this again in about 2019, 2010, we recognized at first we will need to remain very open to global talent to allow them to come in when we want to build out the sector. So when we worked with the Ministry of Manpower back then, I think in 2023, when they roll out the Compass framework. So now if you know, for our employment pass, it's a point-based system. We recognize the various jobs in the carbon market as the kind of jobs where we really have a shortage, and we give so-called extra points in the whole assessment for whether you have sufficient points for the employment pass to be approved. So we remain open, and we want to make sure that we can get the best people in Singapore. Now then, that buys us time to try to address this shortage of talent in Singapore, which I think, Tommy, you sort of mentioned that earlier. And we do it in a few ways. The first will be, of course, we need to work with the Institute of Higher Learning to sort of develop courses to address this gap. And the way we think about it is that we probably need to start equipping sort of mid-career switchers, because at the start, I think we are looking for adjacency. I mean, the feedback from the industry is that in the immediate term, there may not be a lot of new jobs, but a lot of the existing jobs, be it in finance or in other areas, they will need to kind of like have some knowledge of the carbon market so that they can take on a bigger job. And that is where we have worked with NTU to launch the Carbon Market Academy, and I think the take-up is good, which shows that I think there are a lot of people that are looking to broaden their job scope into decarbonization or even to job switch. So this is one of the areas that we look at. The other is to sort of provide what we call a long-term kind of certainty for new job seekers, as well as companies and even mid-career people, to know what are the various jobs out there, what are the different skills that you need to pick up in order that you can sort of have a long-term career in the carbon market. So this is the second step, where together with EDB and Skills Future Singapore, we have come up with a Skills Future framework for the carbon sector. So there are about 10 skills areas and 8 jobs. So we try to be comprehensive, so that it's not just about the carbon trading and the origination, but the adjacent job, which I think Frederick earlier you talked about, that we have to take a more holistic and expansive view. We have done that work, and I think this probably will be out in the Skills Future Singapore's website probably tomorrow or sometime later this week. So these are some of the initiatives, and we continue to welcome ideas from the industry on what else we can do to grow the talent pipeline in Singapore.
Thank you so much, Ivan, for that. I'm going to now move to some of the questions from the audience. So I'm just going to look at some of these. Okay, so we've got one question here, which I will sort of read out. How can both, and this is a question to I think all the panelists really, how can both public and private sectors collaborate to accelerate carbon market talent development in Singapore and Southeast Asia? Any thoughts from the panelists?
So I think that the starting point is that no one single sector should be fully responsible or should be held to be fully responsible to develop the sector. Right? It has to be in partnership with the public, private, but I would also like to include the people sector and the role of NGOs in this as well, right? In developing this carbon market ecosystem. And I think it can be done in a synergistic manner. Right? So, I mean, looking back at my own background, I started from a public sector policy making background. And that has really allowed me to grow of talents if you think about it, like a snakes and ladder system, right? Where you have different points in your career and you can allow talent to transfer across people, private and public sector in the carbon market system. Then you can have a synergistic growth, right? You can have a multiplier effect because that talent can benefit from the different perspectives that each sector brings, right? So this is definitely something that the different sectors can think about how they bring talent, remain open to talent from the different sectors, particularly when we're talking about in this carbon market space that is by nature very synergistic.
Yeah, I would add in my old role, it would be government set rules and markets break them. So, I think there you've got slightly different access there. I think one of the key challenges with potentially, which you probably don't suffer from here, but I can definitely say is an issue in other countries, is actually, are they really speaking at the same level? So the quality of the institutional talent, but I mean those working in the public, I assume government departments, regulators, these sort of areas, do they actually get into the detail? Are they actually equipped to deal with the type of challenges that are being discussed at a private sector? Because that mismatch can sometimes be quite large. And in my experience in the past, particularly areas around financial policy, I used to work for a financial services lobbying agency. That can be a huge thing. So I think it's incumbent upon the public sector to see that there's an upskilling of itself that needs to be treated in order to deal with the vagaries of the private sector. And the private sector, it's incumbent on them to make sure that they are accommodating and hospitable and are actually bringing the public sector services along with them. Because ultimately you can't have a market without both of those two in the playing. But I say sometimes there is a knowledge and a skills gap there, which means that potentially at the very beginning, they're already starting at cross wires.
Thanks. Ivan?
I will look at this from probably two kind of angle. One will be how we can help our neighbors in the Southeast Asia to sort of build up their talent, and one will be how we can work with the industry in Singapore. So on the first, I think my minister also mentioned that earlier. We recognize that in order for Singapore to be able to purchase carbon credit from our neighboring country, like Southeast Asia being a region where we are pushing hard for implementation agreement, we will need to ensure that over there in those countries, they are able to put together the systems, the institutions, and having the skill sets in the public sector as well in order to do this. And this is where our Singapore Corporation Enterprise can come in. They have been running capacity building program for government officials in other countries in diverse areas like in ICT, in infrastructure, and so on. And this is something that we are prepared to work with them so that the government officials in these other countries will likewise have the capability. So this will be across border. Now within Singapore itself, all the manpower initiatives that we have been embarking have always involved the private sector participation. So earlier on I spoke about like the Skill Futures framework. We have involved the private sector in identifying the job types, mapping out the career pathway for the different jobs. And in working with the institutes of higher learning, the way that we always do so when it comes to some of this more kind of specialized kind of area is that we work with them to form like a kind of industry committee so that they can oversee some of this, the development of the curriculum and also the progress for how we have made in rolling out all these courses. When we work with the university, they have also been very proactive in going out to the industry to invite them to give kind of guest lectures in the courses. So these are just some of the ways that we can work with the industry. Now, we also recognize that the companies themselves, you probably also will want to sort of develop your own talent. And some of this could be very bespoke to your company's needs. So for Enterprise Singapore, in the past, we have been working with trading companies to sort of support their in-house kind of program. This is especially useful for people that are joining the company, but they may not have already all the skill sets. But the company need to sort of invest in them, maybe even need to send them overseas for some kind of exposure or rotation. So we recognize that this is upfront cost and investment for companies, and on Enterprise Singapore, we are happy to come in to co-share some of this cost so that companies are also able to sort of put more effort into not just getting available talent, but to build up your own talent so that over time, I think we will have sufficient professionals in Singapore to serve everybody's needs.
Well, thanks, Ivan. You mentioned a pretty interesting comment there about how Enterprise Singapore have worked with some of the trading companies to kind of build that talent. I think just to pick up on that, right, Now the next question is, what adjacent, and this is adding to your point, Tommy and Rueban as well, what adjacent fields or sectors for mid-career switchers have you found to be the most successful in terms of transitioning to carbon? And were there any surprising sectors?
Slightly depends on the role, obviously. I think, should I start with this? I think when you have very specific scientific knowledge that you have to know, whether it's in the technology process, a type of forestry analysis, when there's actually very, very specific skills, you have to go to like sort of complex industry or academia. Like that's the only place that you can get that type of skill set. You know, if you don't know you don't know how to run Monte Carlo models to assess, forest cover, then you just don't know how to do it, right? So that sort of area, I'd say that's quite fertile. The main challenge with potentially academics is working in a commercial tempo, right? That type of cadence is very different to what it means. Likewise, necessarily spending ages and then coming to an opinion and then arguing that opinion is a slightly different way of doing it in commercial research, where you kind of have to put your neck on the line a bit more and basically which is another, again, culturally slightly different. When it comes to the broader skill set in sort of stuff like revenue type activities, sales and marketing, whether it's in-house stuff, maybe technology, I think lots of places, like basically all the big financial banks, all the big commodity houses, all the trading houses, lots of the professional services like the big four, the big three. I find these are all very fertile spaces where you get that general training ground. And likewise, other startups. I think that's actually not to be underestimated. Sometimes people think, because I got trained at one of the large institutions, I'll know what it's like to have to just get roll up my sleeves and get dirty. But actually what you want is some people that have actually done that. So I actually find that in Singapore you have an enormously fertile ground from which to be making that approach. It's only in those very specific areas where if you don't know, you don't know, and that bit you have to kind of get through the actual skills, which is generally something around the interface of science and the implementation of a project.
Fair enough. Rueban?
Then if I add just 3 points, and the first being completely agree with what Tommy said. I think in terms of the bedrock has to be science knowledge, right? And we can't sort of replace that. Right? And it comes with years of background and research, and having worked in that space to have a science-backed opinion, and that to form the basis of carbon markets. The second point is that a key part of carbon markets is understanding risks. And risks not only from a project risk perspective, but also a country risk perspective and a financial risk perspective, right? So in adjacent industries that also have very similar risk management approaches, then they tend to do better coming into this space, right? Because fundamentally understanding risk is a very key component. And that's when, as Tommy said, right, individuals that have worked in the financial sector, for example. But also because country risk is a big risk, people that have worked in international roles that understand countries and the context in which they work tend to do better given the international nature of carbon markets. And the third point that I would like to speak to is that the carbon market space is a fast-growing space, especially in this current era, right? And so because it's a fast-developing space, being nimble and being able to adapt, and Tommy alluded to that in the startup nature, right? So generally, people that have been in startups and understand a fast-growing business tend to do better given the fast-evolving nature of carbon markets that we're in right now.
Ivan, any thoughts?
Yeah, just making a personal observation. I'm not sure whether this is scientific, but in my interaction with quite a number of companies in the energy sector and commodity sector, I did notice that quite a few of them used to have energy background. I think it probably goes back to what Rueban mentioned about, like, in trading of energy products, you got to have a proper risk management system. So probably some of the thinking can be kind of is portable into the carbon market. The other is that I think for those people that used to be in the energy sector, they probably already have a good grasp of decarbonization and the technical aspect of it, so probably it's easier for them to pick it up. Now, the other thing that I found interesting is we do have quite a number of people from the public sector switching to this space. In the various government agencies that I work with, I suppose it's because this is a new sector, and a lot of the development is sort of driven by public policy. So some of my ex-colleagues in the public service who were very involved in this, who know the nuts and bolts of, Article 6.2, Article 6.4, and so on, probably will find that they have something valuable to bring to the table in this growing sector.
Thanks for that. Case in point there. Ruben here. Is it, and maybe this question I'll direct it to Tommy, and or Ruben actually, is it difficult, you think, to attract talent to build their careers in carbon markets, right? Given the volatility, given the recent challenges, long-term uncertainty, and maybe this is coming more from the VCM perspective.
Yeah, I just want to say, as the head of a company that says we assess risk for a living, I think Ruben did a much better answer than I did for my own view of risk. Yeah, that is tricky. I did a brief on what's different between 2025 and 2020 just recently, and I think trying to have certainty in your job in this industry right now is tricky. I think it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, but classically, can the market stay irrational longer than you can stay liquid, which is my favorite Keynes quote, is everyone's current challenge. So I think there's an area, and then that's combined with, the advent of probably a word that hasn't been used this entire session, which is AI. We have a knowledge-based business, and knowledge-based analysis using, latest generation AI is pretty much the best use case of that stuff. So I think there is a structural challenge, those in the industry, which is agnostic to working in climate, which is, will your job be supplemented or at least partially substituted for AI? And then I think, there's certainly an area of, maybe call it what it is. The market needs to consolidate. There's a lot of money that came in 2021, 22, of which people are living off the exhaust fumes who haven't raised fresh capital. And either they have to make it and be profitable, and that profitability horizon might be a lot nearer than they would have liked, i.e. that they need to break even at a number that was a lot lower than they originally thought, because they're not going to be able to have capital to open it. And all of that does translate to some sort of uncertainty, to be sure. But on the other side, for my sins did economic history, the most productive decade of the 20th century was the 1930s. So actually out of periods of potentially, capital constrained areas and even recession, you get the highest productivity. So I'd say for those that can survive this type of period, that's going to where you get the emergent leaders come out for the next 15, 20.
Survival of the fittest, essentially.
Yeah, to an extent, yeah.
Maybe just to add to that as well, it's important not to be singularly focused on carbon markets as a mechanism. Carbon markets is a means to an end, which is how do we combat climate change, right? So I think when you sort of take that perspective, the value proposition becomes much greater, right? So because this is an opportunity to essentially work on a problem that is an existential problem for the world, right? And carbon markets is one vehicle to do that, right? But also carbon markets in itself, if you're talking about that, has unique value proposition in the sense of delivering impact not only to the climate, but also to people and very often to nature as well, right? So because it has an element of bringing these people, nature, and the planet together, that in itself is a way, and it's a value proposition in terms of the impact you can achieve by being in this space, right? So beyond the constraints and challenges that Tommy highlighted in terms of, how do we make the pay competitive, etc. It is a very attractive value proposition from impact perspective.
Understand. No, that's helpful to know. I'm going to ask this next question to you, Ivan, really, which is sort of, and this I think flows from your previous articulation of the Singapore government's strategy to build a talent pipeline here. What does, in your view, a well-developed talent ecosystem in carbon markets look like in 5 years? From your perspective, what's your 5-year horizon? What do you think it will look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if we take a steady state kind of perspective of the carbon market, then I hope that it can be somewhat like our financial services sector in Singapore, which I think is very well developed. So you will have a sort of a good pool of people that can take on the various jobs, and we identify some of the job types from, let's say, the people doing project development, to the accounting, to MRV. So that's one, that we have people that can do all the different job types. Now, the other way to look at it is that we will have, hopefully, I don't know whether we can achieve this in 5 years' time, but we have people that can play or do jobs at a different level. Because you need to have people that are at sort of like the more junior level, and then people at the senior level. Because for a company, because after all, I think our long-term goal is to make sure that Singapore can be a sort of a regional or even global carbon services and trading hub. And which means that, by that it means that company must be comfortable to sort of have your regional headquarters for such services in Singapore, which means that you will have a mix of people in senior position. You also have people sort of in some of the more junior position. So in the ideal stage, we should have people that is across all these different job level. Now, the third dimension is that we want to have a good mix of both global and local talent. We need to make sure that we continue to be open to global talent, because after all, we are talking about a global or regional hub. And when it comes to, let's say, a lot of all this project development and so on, that local knowledge of what is happening out there is actually very important. I think we kind of discussed that in the earlier panel. And at the same time, to ensure that the people in Singapore remain supportive of the government effort to grow this sector, we need to ensure that there's sufficient jobs for Singaporeans, so that we can continue to put in money, continue to have the government agency devote time to grow the sector.
Well, thanks very much, Ivan, for that. We're almost at the end, and I'm going to ask each panelist to, in one sentence, sort of what would your advice be to someone who is a mid-career hire looking to consider whether to join this sector? So what would your one-liner advice be?
So Daniel, as what I started by saying, this is a growth sector, right? It is a fast-growing sector, and the opportunities at this stage are boundless, right? And we are at an important time when we talk about global decarbonization. So be part of that journey to co-create this and deliver the impact that we need to deliver globally. Thank you.
Tommy?
If you know the game Snakes and Ladders, I'm going to use this analogy. A very important motto that I try to live by and tell people is sometimes you have to take a little bit of a ladder to get, a snake to get on a bigger ladder. So don't be afraid to maybe take what might be a slight demotion or a sideways move or something there, because actually this is, to build on Ruben's point, a much potentially bigger and faster ladder than you might otherwise be in your own journey. So basically, don't look at it by saying, oh, I must get a promotion in order to move into this space. Look for an area where you can learn, and in that period, you can bring your skills in, and then actually within 2 to 5 years, you'll find that you're on a much bigger ladder.
Thanks. This is the year of the snake, actually. So it's a great time to make the career move. Last one from you, Ivan.
I would say that decarbonization is here to stay in the long term. So I think we should ignore, or rather sort of like take into stride some of these blips, where countries and companies may recalibrate sort of their climate change target, but it'll be there for the long term. So I think we should look at it that way and be nimble, and like what my other two panelists said, be prepared to take like a sidewalk, but eventually I think be committed to the journey.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, a round of applause for the panelists.